I said in Mexico, the problem primarily is stemming from the fact that you have systemic corruption. Just recently, the former FBI director for Mexico just got a 30-year sentence here in the United States, taking $50 million bribes from Sinaloa. The former Secretary of Defense got arrested in Los Angeles when he was cutting through LAX. He was taking $60 million bribes. But when you're talking cabinet level officers, there's no operations in Mexico where the Secretary of Defense doesn't know about it. But if this guy's getting paid $60 million, that means whatever organization's paying him, they're going to be receiving the inside information. That means the intel that they supply to our boys is going to be flawed. So we're going to get, incomplete or misleading intel on the one hand. And if we're actually going to be attacking the groups that are paying for protection, our boys are walking into ambushes.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. A former returning guest, Pete. How are you, my friend?
Good evening. I'm doing well.
So last time you and I were together, we done 2 shows covering the big Demetrius Flannery situation about his cooperation, or how as we saw it, lack thereof. And I don't really know what constitutes as viral these days, but I know we got a lot of feedback, a lot of comments, a lot of people in my DMs. I was even invited to go on some other shows. A lot of people found it very interesting and found it to be one of the best videos on the internet, at least from the feedback that I got, as far as the breakdown and things like that. Now, since then, you've kind of had another little viral subject matter that you've been talking about. In February, I think you went on a podcast and you dropped a claim that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel paramilitary wing was led by 4 former U.S. special operators. Now, this includes a former Delta Force soldier, 2 ex-Navy SEALs, and a veteran of the 75th Ranger Regiment. And it was met with some skepticism at first, but then it's been corroborated by some former military people. You were on the Borderlands podcast, and also now Rolling Stones has kind of picked this article up, and people are now corroborating what you were saying. Kind of clue us in over here on the crime and entertainment side of, how you come across that information, how it was relayed, and why it's got everybody stirring right now.
Well, the initial contacts with Borderland occurred back in December.
Mm-hmm.
Last summer, and in the spring and the summer, I had a friend who's a significant podcaster with a large platform, and I went on his podcast on a number of occasions, basically helping him, fill content, that kind of stuff. And a number of our discussions focused on the history of the Sinaloa cartel's operations, their development whatsoever. And Jalisco New Generation is an offshoot from Sinaloa.
Right.
And so in 2010, they broke away after the leader of the cartel's operations in Jalisco, a gentleman named Nacho Coronel, was taken out in a decapitation strike. So the Coronel family, along with his partners in the Valencia family, like their sons and nephews, the new generation, stepped up to take over control. Well, they broke outside of the Sinaloa structure and formed their own network. Well, the Jalisco New Generation, formerly member of the Sinaloa faction, they had the most powerful paramilitary wing within the Sinaloa network. And they had recruited former U.S. Special Forces to build that operation. At the time, they were called the Matazetas because they were involved in a war with the paramilitary wing, or the former paramilitary wing of the Gulf Cartel, which themselves were also comprised of American trained special forces. The difference between the Matazetas and Jalisco's group was the leaders were 4 actual Americans, as opposed to Mexicans trained at Fort Bragg. And so their leadership consisted of a Delta Force guy, a couple of Navy SEALs, and a Ranger from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Now, you have to understand, I'm from Los Angeles, LA has served as the principal base of operations for the Sinaloa cartel here in the United States for over 35 years.
Right.
Key operatives who managed the cartel's American-based distribution network, along with some significant players in Mexico, were directly involved in the drug activity charged in the Robles conspiracy, which was at the heart of one of my federal prosecutions. You know,
Mhm.
I'm a Brazilian American of Italian descent. And as a non Mexican Latino with significant contacts, I was always welcomed by the cartel level operatives within the Mexican prisoner community. And so I spent 25 years with these men. I lived alongside them. I developed relationships with many high ranking members of both the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels. I have a deep understanding of their organizational structures, their operational strategies, how they procure their chemicals, how they launder their money. And most importantly, I have firsthand knowledge of how these men think and operate. Living with them for so many years allowed me to gain profound insight into their mindset, the decision making process, and cultural dynamics of the individuals. And so over the course of that extended period, you know, countless discussions with various individuals, including, one of the main drug lords from Mexico, whose family is at the very heart of Jalisco New Generation. And so during the course of our discussions, I came across this information indicating, that you had 4 Americans that were just leaders of the paramilitary wing. Well, I was surprised by the reaction because this is literally common knowledge within the higher level trafficking community. Like, this isn't top secret. Everybody knows. This is one of the, you know, uh, one of Jalisco's claims to fame, essentially, is the fact that their paramilitary wing is led or was built by 4 American special forces. And so I was a little bit surprised given the reaction because even the host on the Borderland podcast, he was like shocked. And, this guy's former special forces, former federal officer. Now he's like, does law enforcement know about this? Like, how do you guys not know about this? Go to any federal prison, talk to any cartel guy, they'll tell you. I mean, it's just common knowledge. And the reaction was shocking, and there was some pushback, a little bit of skepticism. And then the host of the Green Beret Chronicle podcast. You have to understand, I over the course of the last, following my release from prison, I went on my buddy Matt's podcast on a number of occasions.
Right.
After which, I was told by my PO, you can't go on podcasts hosted by felons. And so I focused primarily on, guys contacting me because of my association with the Veterans Reentry Program. So like a lot of military themed podcasts, basically to talk about the program.
Right.
And this is the context in which these discussions arose. Like, hey, what do you think about Trump designating these people? And so those conversations flowed from that. And so, I went on the Green Beret Chronicle podcast. Well, this guy, former special forces, he calls his people in DC. They confirm it. I went on a Navy SEALs podcast. He's a high level contact within the American intelligence community. He says, yes, the CIA knows about the 4 guys I was talking about. They even know their names. And so now these hosts are going on their podcast saying, hey, look, you guys, Rausini knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Then there was a Substack that was prepared by a writer for Rolling Stone who works for like the Wall Street Journal. And he contacted high-level operatives with high-level officials within the DEA, and they confirmed the information. And so that kind of changed the dynamics only because, you have to understand, one, I didn't think this was confidential information because, like I said, it's well known throughout the trafficking community. And 2, there was a lot of happy talk back in December and January prior to the inauguration, where there were individuals who were essentially making ridiculous claims about how easy it's going to be operating in Mexico. Like, in the event there's going to be actual kinetic action where you're sending troops into Mexico. And the reason
Right.
why it was a concern for me is because, one of my best friends is an Army Ranger, 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. On his last air assault prior to returning back stateside to go to Special Forces qualification, he suffers near fatal injuries. And so, like, I've advised and counseled hundreds of combat vets, and I've gotten to know a number of them. And like I said, one of them, he and I are very good friends. Well, I started hearing the same talk of it's going to be a cakewalk. Well, that's what they were saying about Afghanistan. And that's what they were saying about Iraq. I've literally met men whose lives were destroyed. Those who weren't unalived in combat, they come back, their lives are in shambles. I'm like, look, it's not going to be how easy it's being depicted, primarily because these guys are led by American Special Forces. It's not Pancho, the neighborhood drug dealer selling dime bags of weed at the local cantina, that you're going to be fighting. The last time Mexico made moves against Mencho, there were two assaults targeting the leader of Jalisco New Generation. On both of them, on the first one, the ground assault, every one of the Mexican Special Forces were unalived, walked right into an ambush.
Mm.
On the second one, the helicopter attacks, they started blowing the helicopters out of the sky. Well, they have shoulder fire rockets. Like, they don't fight unless their backs are put up against the wall.
Right.
But when their backs are put up against the wall, it's not going to be Pancho. These are men led by American Special Forces, trained by American Special Forces. The body of their group are former Mexican military personnel. Their leaders are Mexican Special Forces, and they bolster it with special forces from Central America, whether it's Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama. All of those group countries send people to the United States to get trained at Fort Bragg, get trained at the School of the Americas in Georgia. Well, when they go back and finish their tour of service with their militaries, they have a skill set that's in high demand. Well, Jalisco New Generation generates $3, $4, $5 billion a year, but they can afford to pay these guys.
And that's an attractive salary to some of these people.
Well, again, yes, one, it's obviously a very attractive salary. And two, it's important not to use hindsight, because when the men became involved, there wasn't none of the designations that have recently happened were in play. Like, they didn't know that 10 years later, Jalisco New Generation is going to be declared a terrorist organization and predator drones are attacking them. And so at the time, the men got involved with what they got involved with. They were making their money. It just ballooned into something that no one could have foreseen. And now they're just stuck in a spot where either they're going to defect, which would mean coming back to the United States and being in trouble, or riding it out in Mexico. And so when I had the initial conversations with the borderland people before the inauguration, I was like, look, my concern is I've had numerous friends that were participating in air assaults in Afghanistan who suffered catastrophic injuries. Well, they were dropping into ambushes all the time, and the Taliban didn't have inside information. I said, in Mexico, the problem primarily is stemming from the fact that you have systemic corruption. And you can't engage in kinetic action when your so-called ally is undermining you at every turn. Now, when I say the Mexican government, I don't mean the Mexican government as a whole, but elements of the Mexican government.
Yeah.
We've had just recently the former FBI director for Mexico just got a 30-year sentence here in the United States. He's taking $50 million bribes from Sinaloa. The former Secretary of Defense got arrested in Los Angeles when he was cutting through LAX. He was taking $60 million bribes. Well, when you're talking cabinet level officers, there's no operations in Mexico where the Secretary of Defense doesn't know about it.
Right.
Well, if this guy's getting paid $60 million, that means whatever organization's paying him, they're going to be receiving the inside information. That means the intel that they supply to our boys is going to be flawed. So we're going to get, incomplete or misleading intel on the one hand. And if we're actually going to be attacking the groups that are paying for protection, our boys are walking into ambushes.
Yeah, they're going to lay out the blueprint they're going to give them our game plan, essentially, whatever.
It's now, things are a little bit, many of those concerns are now obviated because of the way Mr. Trump has played his cards. But at the time these discussions were taking place prior to the inauguration, my concern was like, look, when you start talking about collaborating with your partners in the Mexican government, like, that's a disaster waiting to happen. You can't rely upon a government that is compromised at its core. And I'm not suggesting that Ms. Scheinbaum, the current president, is corrupt. But during the course of Chapo Guzman's trial, it came to light that 2 presidents ago, Peña Nieto, upon his winning the presidency, but before being sworn into office, he sent word over to Zambada. Him and his people needed $250 million. That's off the top. They're coming in the door demanding 9-figure payoffs.
Yeah.
Now Zambada came back and said, "Look, they're not paying 250. We'll give you 100 million." So they settled for the 100 million. Well, if you're getting into bed with the country whose Secretary of Defense is dirty, FBI director is dirty, DEA chief is dirty, like literally every one of these guys, Cienfuegos, Luna, Ramirez, you had 5 cabinet level officers spend to split $270 million in bribes. You had the next president receive $100 million in bribes. You had $450 million in bribes just amongst 11 officials. And these are the people that you're going to be partnering with? So now, look, if you want to engage in kinetic action, that's fine. But be very careful when you're getting into bed with the Mexican government, only because the institutions have been compromised, and they've been compromised for decades.
Right. That's what I was going to say. It's not like this just started happening. This has been going on for quite a while.
And see, and the point, I mean, another one of the insights that came to light in Renato Luna's trial, and he was just recently sentenced like 18 months ago to 30 years. He started getting bribed 25 years earlier. Like he didn't become corrupt at 53, 54 when he was named their FBI director. He'd been on the take for 2 decades. You know, back in the mid 1990s when they were landing 737s at the air base in Sonora, bringing in 13, 14, 15 metric tons per flight, well, every officer on that base's chain of command was getting his envelope. Well, the guys that were lieutenants back in 1995 today are generals. They've been getting envelopes for the last 30 years.
And climbing the ladder.
And climbing the ladder, same thing. You know, the Luna trial showed that they target individuals, particularly, you know, when you're younger, 27, 28, 29, they're broke young guys. They need a nice place, they want a nice car, so it's easy to corrupt them at that age. Then they get them hooked, and then you develop this lifelong relationship. And so my concern is not that our forces couldn't prevail. It's don't rely on the Mexican government if you're going to put our boys at risk.
Right.
Because we've seen what happens with respect to both assaults that they took against Menchel. There was an officer at the base that compromised it, called his handler from Jalisco, tipped him off, "Hey, they're coming." And on both circumstances, it was just ambushes. And so I think that the reaction was very interesting, only because you have individuals here in the United States who really don't know what they're talking about, making statements like there's no basis for you to, like, I know the traffickers. I was involved in trafficking. I've lived 2 decades with these men. Like, I know how the operations are conducted. Like, they're not going to attack, but if pushed their back up against the wall, they're going to defend themselves. And the problem, I think, with how things have been depicted is that there's there was a little too much happy talk. Now, fortunately, Mr. Trump has taken a different course of action. You know, his designation shortly after he was inaugurated, he designated a half a dozen of the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. And so people are all caught up in the fact that he's targeting the cartels. He's not targeting the cartels. He's targeting the Mexican government. And we see he's doing so because he's using asymmetric tactics in the form of tariffs. The tariffs pose an existential threat to the Mexican economy. And so he's able to manipulate and maneuver the Mexican authorities into undertaking action that aligns with our incentives. Because in the end, our incentives are to stop the trade, and I'm going to say it one time, fentanyl-related products. You know, that's the goal. There was actually a big report in the LA Times just a few weeks ago where Trump administration officials speaking on background said, look, they're not trying to interfere with the coke. They're not trying to interfere with the crystal. They just want to stop the fentanyl. because the Feni is what's resulting in 75, 80, 90,000 fatalities a year.
Right.
And if Mr. Trump's able to stop the synthetic opioid trade, that achievement would make him, go down as one of the greatest presidents of all time, simply because of the impact of that operation. Like, I don't get political. However, the tactics he's using are he's uniquely qualified simply because he's prepared to undertake action no other president would do. Because no other president would slap the type of tariffs he would on Mexico. Mr. Trump essentially tore up his own agreement he entered into with Mexico 5 years ago.
Right.
And, he makes somewhat outrageous statements. He's going to take Greenland. He's going to take back the Panama Canal. He's going to take Canada. Well, the Mexican government sees this. They know, hey, we got a loose cannon on deck. What do we have to do to stop from getting crushed? And you see they're actually taking actions to curtail the Feni while trying to appease Trump.
Right.
And so one of the big deals was the fact that they rounded up 29 guys and they sent them to the United States. And so while the majority of the guys, like the one that got the most notoriety was Caro Quintero, who was a large trafficker from the predecessor group in Guadalajara. He was responsible for unaliving a DEA agent in Camarena. So while, of course, that was a significant victory for the DEA and the American Department of Justice, operationally, look, the guy's in his 70s. He spent 40 years in a Mexican prison. He didn't get out of prison in his 70s and take over. The guys in their 30s and 40s aren't listening to a guy in his 70s.
Right.
Okay, so today his activities were relatively insignificant. Historically, they were very significant. The impactful decision by the Mexican government wasn't so much sending over these guys in their 60s and 70s that were essentially out of the game. It was sending over the guys that got arrested 2 weeks earlier, 3 weeks earlier. Because in Mexico, in order for the cartels to operate, and what people need to understand, and when I say, look, there is no cartel. There are 9 different cartels.
Right.
And so each one of those operates in different territory where they've corrupted the political officials in the area to get protection. Law enforcement, federal law enforcement, military personnel, and of course, the political class. And so you've got 9 cartels that operate independently. Each cartel is conformed of different organizations. And so for Sinaloa, it's a network consisting of 44 different organizations as of a year and a half ago. Jalisco New Generation is 27 organizations spread out over 10 Mexican states. Like, here's the 2 organizations, the 2 networks together. Well, that 44 organization network was Sinaloa. The 27 organization network is Jalisco. Well, each one of those organizations operate different areas. Now, the reason why you're able to get a 27 organization network operating in 10 Mexican states is because the authorities are complicit. We have no comparable we have no comparable structures like that in the United States.
Right.
Even the mafia in its heyday back in the 50s and 60s didn't have more than a couple thousand guys, and they operated in only a handful of cities.
Yeah.
Philly, some parts of Jersey, New York, the East Coast, Chicago, a number of cities, but it was small. They didn't have anything comparable to this.
No.
And so the reason why that exists is because of something that's called the protection market. And in 2007, the American government persuaded the then president of Mexico, Calderon, to adopt what is essentially the same decapitation strike strategy that we operated in Afghanistan and Iraq. The previous summer, they'd taken out a scumbag in Iraq named Zarqawi, very highly publicized attack. And so they're saying, hey, this will work also in Mexico. Well, the reason why it didn't work in Mexico is because in Iraq and Afghanistan, we weren't collaborating with those governments. We were just doing what needed to be done.
Right.
Whereas in Mexico, they partnered with the Mexican government. Well, the FBI director is the gentleman we were talking about earlier, Genaro Luna. Well, their FBI director. Well, he got a $50 million bribe. The Secretary of Defense got a $60 million bribe. Ramirez got a $30 million bribe. Like, you can't partner with the government when their cabinet level officers are on the take. And so the creation of the protection market, the decapitation strategy, allowed for corrupt Mexican military officials and political leaders to monetize their political influence because they knew now there's a credible threat. If you get apprehended, you're going to go to the United States because it was either take out the leaders, the cartel leaders in military strikes, or apprehend them and send them to the United States. Well, if they come to the United States, and they knew it was serious because in 2007, Calderon sent the first dozen guys. Well, you're talking about one of the leaders of the Gulf Cartel, the actual leader, Ociel Cardenas, Guedo Palma, the old leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, Ariano, the leader of Tijuana Cartel. I mean, these guys were monsters. Armando Valencia. And so that, in conjunction, that exportation of their criminals to the United States for prosecution, in conjunction with the new American policy, allowed for these corrupt Mexican political leaders to go to the cartels and say, hey, if you give me 50 million, I'll protect you. I'll deflect the Americans' attentions onto your rivals. And when they're targeting you guys, we'll compromise the operations by leaking info. Well, Sinaloa stepped up and just started paying the 50 million to this guy, 60 to this guy, 30 to this guy, 100 to that guy. And so the protection market collapsed in Mexico because Mexico is not Norway and Mexico is not Switzerland, where you can rely on their federal law enforcement apparatus. In Mexico, the protection market allowed for these corrupt officials to charge extraordinary rents. Mm-hmm. Now, the downside of this was it required the cartels, and in particular, this is where Sinaloa really captured the moment, to transition. Up until 2007, they were primarily cocaine operations. The first full year of Sinaloa's operations was 1990. Well, for the first 17 years, there was a status quo. The guys would get apprehended. They do their time in Mexico. Prison in Mexico for the cartel guys are sweet.
Yeah.
And so, okay, they got to go do their time. They go do their time. And they've got very different laws in Mexico. They don't have concepts such as vicarious liability or co-conspirator liability. They don't charge you with 3 tons if you didn't get caught with any product.
Right.
That's an American concept. So down there, the guys didn't get onerous sentences and their time was very sweet. Well, once you're going to start sending them to the United States, they had no choice but to have to step up and pay the $50 million bribe. Like, they didn't offer the guy 50 and the next guy 60. Those guys demanded the money. Otherwise, we're just going to let the Americans take you. And so that prompted the cartels to have to pivot to drugs that are more lucrative, which is why in 2007 forward, you had a move where they continued with the coke, but they went all in on the crystal. And the reason why they went all in on the crystal was because there's a 700 to 800% return on investment on the crystal. Whereas on the coke, it's 150 to maybe 200%. So if you're a businessman, if you got just to keep it easy, if you got $1 million, are you going to invest that capital in a transaction where you're going to get back $2.5 million, or are you going to invest it where you get back $8 million? Well,
right, easy math.
Easy math. And as the protection market expanded, as the American law enforcement efforts continued, you had more and more of the cartels. Sinaloa initially focused on the crystal. Now, within the Sinaloa structure, the faction that controlled the crystal was the group in Jalisco under Nacho Coronel. See, Jalisco contains the city of Guadalajara, which is the second largest city in Mexico. the third largest city in Mexico, but it's the heart of Mexican culture. It's also essentially their version of Silicon Valley. You got a lot of technical universities, a lot of very good schools in that area. And so what you had was an ability to create a manufacturing capacity in and around Guadalajara. Also important is because the two largest ports in Mexico on the Pacific coast are in the neighboring states of Colima and Michoacan, where they fell under the territory of the Nacho Coronel faction of the Sinaloa cartel. This is how Coronel went on to become like the third most powerful drug lord within its structure, because he had control of the crystal. And so later on, when the American government took out Coronel in a decapitation strike, his organization broke away. That's how New Generation really captured the crystal, because New Generation is essentially the old Coronel organization working with the old Valencia organization.
Okay.
And so all of the cartels saw the power concentrating in Sinaloa with respect to the crystal. Well, this kicks off a concept that's called, it's a game theoretic concept called multipolar traps. And it's essentially when your adversary engages in a course of conduct that allows him to accrue more money, which in Mexico translates into more power. See, in Mexico, power is defined by access to corrupt political figures. It's not weapons, it's not paramilitary groups, it's politicians.
Yeah.
And
Who's people that are going to allow you to operate?
who allows you to operate, and it deflects law enforcement attention from you. It also compromises operations targeting you. And more importantly, it feeds information to other authorities about your rivals.
Right.
And so between 2007 and 2010, the Mexican military undertook 5 military campaigns. They mobilized 65,000 soldiers, and the American government underwrote the entire effort. Now, the guys in charge were Luna, the guy getting to 50 million. Cienfuegos, the guy getting to 60 million. And so George W. Bush is just cutting checks. And so, Luna picks up the phone, calls his handlers from Sinaloa and says, hey, who do you want us to go get? The gringos are paying for it. Go get them guys in Michoacan. Go get those guys in Tijuana. Well, there were literally 5 military campaigns involving 65,000 Mexican soldiers. The American government, the taxpayers, spent $4 billion financing this operation. And the guys calling the shot the entire time were the men up in Sinaloa's mountains, talking to their corrupt politicians. Go get these guys. Go get these guys. We paid for it all. We gave them tanks, troop transports, helicopters. Do you realize that twice in Sinaloa's history, they were on their back feet? I mean, they were literally on the point of being extinguished. And both times, the American government stepped in and literally wiped out their adversaries. And that's the hallmark of Sinaloa. They fancy themselves as more clever than powerful. They don't see themselves as strong. That's a misconception that we have here in this country. Drug organizations are collections of men who come together to engage in drug trafficking to earn a living. Cartels are collections of organizations.
Right.
The function of the cartel isn't making money. Sinaloa didn't, when it initially formed the 7-8 organizations that came together to form that cartel, it wasn't to make money. The individual organizations focused on making the money. The cartel came together for security. Think of it like NATO. It's a defense pact. That's how they defended themselves against the other more powerful cartels, which truly weren't cartels. They were just organizations. But the difference between Sinaloa and the other groups is the other groups were all nestled along the American border. Tijuana, Sonora, Juarez, the Gulf. Well, they were literally on the border. Sinaloa's 900 miles from the border. It's not a border state.
When was the first time they were almost wiped off?
In late 1990s.
Okay.
In the late 90s, because you had Sinaloa was the weakest of the cartels, and it had the least advantages. Like their contacts in Colombia were the smaller of the two Colombian groups. So they were dealing with Cali, not Medellin. And they had to get the product in. They'd bring it over from Guatemala. Well, it's 1,500 miles to Sinaloa. Then they got to go another 1,000 miles to Los Angeles. So they got to travel the furthest. They had to work with the smaller Colombian groups. And that's why Sinaloa has never really focused on conquering territory because there was just too much land. They partnered with local groups. Like the local group in the border area of Guatemala, they're responsible for getting it across the border and taking it 300 miles. Then another group will take it 400 miles. Then another group will take it 250 miles. All along the way, you need the local groups because in order for these operations to work, you got to bribe the officials.
Right.
Well, a guy from Sinaloa can't go walking into the police station in Nogales, south of the Arizona border, and ask who's the crooked cop. It doesn't work that way. If you're going to bribe the police chief, you have to approach him through somebody that he trusts.
Mhm.
That means you have to have a local contact. So Sinaloa will find in our example south of the Arizona border was an organization called the Salazars. Well, the Salazars were responsible for maintaining the border operation south of Arizona. They contracted with Sinaloa because the Salazars had one of the things they do is they map out all of the relationships. Well, one of the guys went to high school with the mayor. Another guy's brother-in-law is the chief of police. Another guy's dad is the governor. And so they're able to figure out how can we get to these various political officials because they go through family members because in the event the guy turns down the bribe, they're not going to bust the people trying to bribe. They're not going to arrest their brother.
Right.
And they know their brother's not setting them up. So you always, when it's, bribing is no different than trafficking. You don't walk up to a guy, even if he's a big trafficker, you don't walk up to him and say, hey, bro, I heard you're a player. I want to get some work. He won't talk to you. He doesn't think you're setting him up. Now, if you want to get to him, you got to go through somebody that knows him.
Right.
Well, the same principle applies for bribes. If you're going to bribe the judge, you got to go through one of the judge's family members. Well, who knows somebody in that family or who's related by marriage to that family or who went to high school with that family? It's got to be locals, which is why Sinaloa has a 44 organization structure where each organization is responsible for an operation in that area, which includes bribing the local political figures because everybody knows somebody from that particular, from their particular zone, essentially. And so the protection market, after it got up and running, worked for Sinaloa because they were the ones who paid the $500 million in bribes. Now, where things took an unfortunate turn was when the Mexican government undertook the 5 campaigns. They didn't have a campaign targeting Sinaloa. The other cartels all got crushed. In 2010, Jalisco New Generation breaks away. They formed a Jalisco New Generation. Well, as it started accruing more and more power, because they were the ones that were really behind the crystal, they inherited the labs, and their territory included the ports. Well, those are strategic assets. You can't replicate ports.
Right.
And so, as they were accruing more and more strength, the Peña Nieto presidency, the president that took the 100 million from Sinaloa, they started targeting Jalisco New Generation. And so, after the two, you had the first ground assault, then you had the air assault, then they had an operation called Operation Jalisco. They put like 10,000 troops in the state, 5,000 in Guadalajara. The leadership had to run up into the mountains. This is the group that was whose paramilitary wing was led by the American Special Forces. So they were able to escape. Well, they needed to start raising more money. They weren't making enough money with the crystal to provide protection. So that's when they pivoted into the synthetics. That's when they went all in on Fenny. Because on the Coke side, it's 150 to 200% return on investment. On the crystal side, 800% return on investment. On the Fenny, 2,400%. And so now they were able to start amassing enormous amounts of capital, which of course translates into power because now you're going to be able to offer bigger bribes. So if the Secretary of Defense is getting 60 million with these guys, well, now they can come in and say, well, okay, we'll double it. And so now they were able to start purchasing higher levels of political protection. That in turn prompts the rival groups. The guys in Sinaloa watch Jalisco New Generation start accruing all this power. So what do they have to do? they now have to pivot into the Feni. Like, even if they weren't interested in doing so,
They have to keep up.
they're stuck in a trap. So
Yeah.
in a multipolar trap, the conduct of a particular group, which from their perspective is rational, has the unintended consequence of escalating the very behavior you're trying to stop for all of the other groups. Pretty soon you had Jalisco getting involved. You had Jalisco first, then you had Sinaloa, then you had the Northeast. Next thing you know, you got all these cartels are scrambling to keep up. So now everybody pivoted into the Feni. Now we've got the situation we've got today. And although obviously, the cartels and the organizations are responsible for their conduct, their activities, along with the activities of the Mexican government, take place within the landscape that's shaped by American policy. And so the decapitation policy is what led to them pivoting to the crystal and then pivoting to the Feni. And so when you see Mr. Trump designating the organizations, that's not who he's really targeting. He's going after the Mexican government because he wants to undermine the protection market. So when those 29 guys get sent to the United States a month ago to much public fanfare, the ones that were important were the guys that had gotten arrested 2 or 3 weeks earlier.
Right.
Because that demonstrated that the protection market collapsed. The guys that had been in prison for 30 years and got sent over, well, they were being protected in Mexico. They didn't come to the US. We've been trying to get them for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. Well, they saw that their protection collapsed. But more importantly, the active individuals, the guys who got arrested just 2 weeks earlier, hadn't even been to court yet. They get put on a plane and sent to the United States. So that puts every trafficker in Mexico on notice. If you get apprehended, you're not going to be able to rely on the crooked judges and your smart lawyers and corrupt politicians or corrupt prosecutors to gum up the works. They're just bypassing everything. Well, that's a direct consequence of Trump's policy of cracking them with tariffs.
That's what I was about to ask you. So how is the tariff, what he's doing with the tariffs? Because most people aren't looking at it from this side of things. They're just seeing that he's putting on tariffs to try to make money. Because what he said before, I think he said this on Joe Rogan, before people started paying taxes, the world ran on tariffs. So this is not some kind of concept that he dreamt up. I mean, it at one time was an established way that we ran. Then everybody started paying taxes and it had shifted. So how is what he's doing with the tariffs directly impacting them? You're saying it's collapsing the protection organization?
Well, what he did is he's forcing the Mexican government to bypass their normal procedures in order to essentially appease Trump to get some of the pressure off. He keeps dangling these, he'll put 20% on, but then he'll drop it down to 10. And he's going to crack them with tariffs, but then he suspends it for 30 days, or then he suspends it for 9. So he's essentially playing a game of cat and mouse.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they have to keep jumping to satisfy him. And one of the ways they're doing it is by trying to demonstrate you had massive seizures of Feni production deep in the country. So they're targeting the Feni productions deep in Mexico. On top of that, they're apprehending individuals and sending them to the United States by bypassing the judicial process. So they invoke the national security law, which, you have to understand, from 1994 through today, the economy of Mexico and the United States were essentially integrated through NAFTA. Mm-hmm. And so Mexico is our largest trading partner. If he puts tariffs on Mexico, it's going to prompt the American manufacturers who set up all those thousands of factories, like all our factories that went from Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana, they went to Mexico.
Right.
Well, if he's going to tariff those goods, it's going to incentivize those companies to bring the factories back to the United States. So Mexico cannot withstand a tariff war. They're in a very different circumstance than China. Mm-hmm. And so Mexico has to appease Mr. Trump. And so he's able to use that asymmetric threat, that unconventional threat, to essentially make them do what he wants. He's essentially coercing the Mexican government. But in this particular case, he's not in the wrong. I mean, you can't have 90,000 Americans getting unalived every year.
Right.
And so that's why I say, in this particular circumstance, with respect to targeting the Feni operations in Mexico, Trump's uniquely qualified.
Yeah.
We can't speak as to what everything else is going on, but in this particular context, the 100% right course of action. Only because he is going to force the Mexican military and the Mexican government to curtail the production. Because in the end, the Mexican government knows where the operations are.
Mhm.
And they can, the authorities in Mexico can go to the various cartels and say, hey, look, just shut down the production. We'll make our money. We can eat off the coke. We can eat off the crystal. Like, the gringos aren't going to do nothing about that. That's a law enforcement matter.
Right.
When you're talking 80, 90, 100,000 American civilians every year getting unalived through the counterfeit oxys, the counterfeit perkies, well, that's just not viable. And that's the red line that they have to address.
Mhm.
And so the concerns that I had initially when I went on Borderland the first time, it was saying, hey, look, you can't partner with the Mexican government and send troops into Mexico because you're sending our boys into ambushes.
Mhm.
This tactic that Trump is using is actually much more effective. He's just essentially bulldogging them.
Yeah. He's kind of, I would like to classify as maybe like crippling from the inside. He's taking what they used as a benefit, but when you're taking that away, now what do those guys have? Like you said, they're going to, if they got caught over there, they're going to cushy prisons. If anybody's ever seen the movie Goodfellas, it's probably something like that, if not even more lavish. I mean, hell, when Pablo went to jail, he built the prison he was in.
Look, I had a friend who did 7 years in a Mexican prison. He slept with at least 200 beautiful women. They bring in hookers all the time. He fathered 7 children with 6 women. And 7, he had to get out, buy houses. See that houses all over Mexico. Imagine, he's the guy, his hair turned all gray. He's got to deal with, you know, the 7 women clamoring for money, school, and all the cars and businesses. The guy's a nightmare. Like, but anyhow, yes. And so, they had every weekend they brought in parties. They bring in bands. They have, like I said, women come stay with them for 3-4 days at a time. Uh, every,
Essentially, it sounds like a vacation.
yeah. Look, put it this way: the Mexican cartel guys, and in those prisons, live better than 80% of the men in the United States.
Jeez.
And keep in mind, they're still running their operations too.
Yeah, they're still running everything. They're running
And like, I've
state of
seen
the
photos, like, state of the art electronics, beautiful computers, beautiful furniture, bombshell hookers. He's got like 2 or 3 women at a time staying with him. And it's the whole way. You'd have like 15 cartel guys on that wing, and they'd have 30 or 40 women come stay for 4 or 5 days with them. The girls show up with their
art.
bags. They bring in bands. So they go from that to coming to the US to go to ADX. They'll be there with Guzman.
Yeah, it's a slightly different scenario.
And so you see the pressure is being put, the pressure isn't being put on the cartel guys, it's being put on the Mexican government to rein in the cartel guys. And in the end, what you're going to see
Hey, you fix this Finney problem.
to fix that, you fix this Feni problem.
Yeah.
Because it's just, and that, no president can stand by and allow those kind of numbers of fatalities. You had like 600,000 fatalities in the last 5 years. That's not, that's a very different world from my world where it was ecstasy and coke or
Right.
crystal. This is now, you know, orders of magnitude different.
And I think those war on drugs, if you want to classify that as what it is a game that will always be played. There's never going to be a winner. That they're going to try to find a way to get it in. We're going to try to find a way to stop it, but I think it's understood. It's almost at this point a mutual respect type thing. They're going to do what they're going to do. We're going to try to stop them. If we get it, good. If we don't. But when you're talking about taking out that many people with the results of the ODs from the Finney, that's something that we can't tolerate. So he's crippling that, like you said, almost tongue in cheek without saying it. Continue with your other shit, but this has got to stop. We can't have this many people.
He'll never say that publicly, but
Right.
yeah, administration officials have already told reporters. Like I said, there was a big article in the LA Times where they said, look, this is what they're aiming for. Essentially, they want to do is they want to return back to where things were in 2014.
Right.
Because, like I said, for the first 17 years, from 1990 to 2007, there was a status quo. We broke the status quo. And then from 2007 to 2015, things were just degenerating with respect to both the crystal and the regular opioids. Then in 15, it went all in on the synthetics, and it's just been a disaster ever since. And so their goal, I think, is to return to 2014. Because here's the thing you have to understand about Trump. Trump has a level of street smarts that is unusual for somebody with his background. You know, his family was very wealthy. He went to very private schools. But here's the thing he grew up in Queens.
Yeah.
And whether it's through osmosis or just through, like, you're not a boy on a little league team in Queens without one of your teammates' dad being in the mob.
Correct.
You know, he came up in that world, particularly because he was in the real estate business. And he succeeded in the real estate business, throughout the 1980s. Well, that's when, the mob was controlling concrete, controlling windows, controlling the union trades.
Yeah, you couldn't build a fucking doghouse in New York without the mob getting a piece of it in some way.
He was able to operate and succeed in an environment where everybody was sharks.
Yeah.
And you know, again, I'm an independent, but I'm libertarian, and so I've basically lost confidence in both parties for the most part. And so I was very shocked when Trump won the first time, and I took an interest in what was going on because from the beginning I thought the whole Russia thing was bullshit. And what was interesting for me is because my prosecutor was Robert Mueller, and he was the guy named as special counsel.
Right.
And I knew that, Mueller engages in some very questionable investigation and prosecutorial tactics. And that was the last case that Mueller prosecuted before he targeted Trump. And
Okay.
so I was watching that whole thing, and about, I don't know, maybe a few months into the first administration, the FBI director, Comey, gets fired or whatever the hell it is, and the attorney general steps down and they appoint the special counsel. And Trump made a statement that told me that we were going to be all right, where he was like, at the lowest moment of his administration, he basically spoke out to, his advisors, like, where's my Roy Cohn? That told me all I need to know. Like, okay, we'll be fine. Because Roy Cohn is the kind of guy, he was a fixer. Trump didn't say, bring me a guy from Harvard Law School. He didn't say, bring me somebody from Williams and Connolly, any of those big law firms. He's like, no, where's my Roy Cohn? Like, you want to get dirty, I'm going to get dirtier. Well, that was an insight into his psyche. And so, although that may not necessarily work well with other contexts, in this particular
Right.
context, you need
Work
that
well.
where's my Roy Cohn mentality. Because he's just, like I said, he's essentially extorting the Mexican government into aligning their incentives with his. And the thing about Trump is also he's wise enough to understand that essentially drug trafficking, it's a free market enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And another one of the problems our government has is, in addition to having senior level bureaucrats that primarily go to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and aren't competent for adversaries that are functionally illiterate, the other problem we have is they don't incorporate market forces into any of their strategies. Here, as our species has unleashed the two most powerful forces on this planet, which are nuclear forces and market forces. And Trump understands that, like you indicated, targeting the coke or targeting the crystal that's something that's a law enforcement matter because people are going to do whatever they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because those compounds weren't resulting in 600,000 fatalities in 5 years.
Right.
That's not crippling the Mexican economy through tariffs. That's just bolstering law enforcement, building a wall, doing whatever other tactics they were going to utilize. Because you have to understand, and I made this point, I think, on the Green Beret Chronicle podcast, where I said, look, 600 years ago is celebrated as the age of uh, exploration. Well, what people don't understand is Christopher Columbus wasn't an explorer. He was a greedy businessman. He had came up with an idea where he was going to be able to find a trade route to the Indies that was much shorter than the route that they were currently having to utilize. And so he was able to sell that dream to the Spanish monarchy. They agreed to bankroll that operation. Now, keep in mind, 600 years ago, the majority of people on the planet thought the planet was flat.
Mm-hmm.
Like the guy had no rudders, he had no logs, no maps, he had no idea the storm seasons that they were going to have to encumber. And he had to be able to sell this to raise a crew to man those boats. Well, he had to explain to the men, look, we're on a state-sponsored mission. We're putting our lives at risk. Now, to Columbus's credit, he wasn't one of the guys who sent men out and stayed behind at the port. He was on the boats himself.
Yeah.
But every one of those sailors that got on those boats knew that they were subjecting themselves to a horrific death at sea. Getting on boats that weren't today's modern ships. These were old rickety ass boats. They get caught in
Yeah.
a storm, they fell apart.
Yeah. They're done.
So, and most of the men didn't even know the planet was round. They thought the earth was flat. They didn't know if they're going to just sail right off the cliff. And so, despite every one of those circumstances, which would have caused most men to say, you know what, I'm going to pass on the opportunity, he was able to raise a crew for those 3 ships despite those risks. Why? Because it is a fundamental aspect of human nature that men will take extraordinary risks for the chance to become wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
Like our society is built on that. Even though every one of those men knew they were putting their lives in extreme danger, they got on them rickety ass boats. Now, fast forward 600 years later. Every drug trafficker knows that the overwhelming majority are going to either end up dead or in prison. The largest operation in the world is based out of China. You know, people talk about Sinaloa at their peak 15 years ago. That was the largest operation in the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't the largest drug operation in the world. Kongsi out of South China is the largest operation. Well, the country on this planet with the harshest drug laws is China. They execute thousands of traffickers every year. It doesn't stop them from being able to replenish their supplies because it's human nature for people to bank on not being the one getting caught.
Yeah.
And so you have to understand those 2 aspects of human nature means that no matter how hard the punishments are or how risky the endeavor, the riskier it is, the more lucrative it is, you're going to entice more men to get involved. Just like the guys got on Columbus's rickety ass boats. Well, the people who get on the rickety ass boats today are the drug traffickers.
Right.
And I think,
And all of them probably had that mindset of, well, we can do it and get away with it. Cause you do for a period of time, just just like we covered the BMF situation. I mean, make no mistake about it. Those guys were moving a lot of product and probably did feel invincible to a certain degree, but it all falls down eventually.
and so, I think the administration has taken the more reasonable stance because they understand that, no one is more powerful than the market. And quite frankly, you're not going to change human nature.
Mhm.
So at least align the landscape, shape the adversary's landscape so that they're going to stop the Feni and then just double up on the law enforcement, build the wall, do whatever the hell they're going to do. And so I actually think the one area where we're going to see a big success with respect to Trump's administration is specifically in this context. And that was the point I was trying to make on the borderlands. But during the course of those discussions, the audience was going nuts. You know, the, ridiculous comments on people who don't know anything about trafficking, wanting to argue. Like a couple of weeks after I was on, they had Jay Flores come on Borderland.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Jay Flores and his brother were the largest two drug traffickers in American history. And I'm familiar with Jay.
Right.
And so, I understand. I'm very familiar with his operations. And in a 4-year period, Jay was responsible for $2 billion worth of product. They operate on a level no other Americans have ever operated on. And after his appearance, you got the comments, people calling, writing in saying, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. It's like, like
That's the YouTube world, man.
I'll tell him, they wanted to, in Los Angeles, that's Sinaloa's primary base of operations. The coke operations were literally like the number one and number two. The number one for the coke and the number one for the meth both lived in my hometown of West Covina, up in the hills, South Hills area. The coke operation was ran out of Arcadia. The meth operation was ran out of Newport Beach. We're talking two of the wealthiest cities in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you're going to find the operations. The labs, I got charged for the labs. We're in Beverly Hills. So you had the coke operation being ran out of Arcadia, the meth operation being ran out of Newport Beach, the labs were in Beverly Hills, the stash pad for the coke operation was in Brentwood, and the stash pad for the meth operation was in Corona del Mar. Like, these are some of the most affluent communities in the United States. There ain't a single gang member within miles of either of those cities. And these people are like complaining, like, he's not talking about the gangs. Sinaloa doesn't operate with gangs. Are you insane? Why would you put a stash house in a gang-infested area? A lot of law enforcement scrutiny. No. There's wealthy enclaves. They don't operate in those. They're based out of those cities.
Yes. You want a stash house somewhere completely unknown, away from all the shenanigans that's going on with anything from the street. You want that in, like you said, Newport Beach, where nobody's going to expect it.
Yeah, that's literally the two biggest meth traffickers in the United States lived in Newport Beach. And you'd go a few miles over to Corona del Mar, that's the stash house.
Yeah. And I've only been to California one time, but when I went last year to speak with Michael Francis, he's in the Newport Beach area, and I was waiting a little bit to do it. And I mean, that was just like, it was a beautiful city. You could just tell you were around money. Everybody up there had money.
One of the wealthiest cities in the country. And that was like I said, the meth base for Sinaloa.
Yeah.
And, of course, everybody knows Beverly Hills, and the same thing with Arcadia. That was the coke operation. And so that's why I was a little surprised at just how uninformed so many people are. Only because, like, even the host from Borderland, he's from Los Angeles. He's like, Arcadia? I'm like, yeah. Or you've got like all those like all equestrian properties up in the hills, like around Monrovia, near Arcadia. So, what do you think are in them trailers?
Yeah.
Not horses. Or what do you think's concealed in the trailers, even with the horses?
I think it's like a weird dichotomy of some sort, that all these people in the comments think that their local areas and their local guys and their local big shots and their local pushers are the king of the crop, when they're really the farthest thing from it. And look, it's hard to like defend that I'm not disparaging drug dealers, but just because you're a big level guy, and we've made this comparison before, in St. Louis, that is nothing compared to somewhere in California. And that is also nothing from people that are dealing at cartel level. It's completely different worlds. It's miles apart. And people, I don't think, realize that.
I think part of the confusion stems from the fact that people just say the cartel. That's the point I made earlier.
Yes.
There's 9
Yeah.
cartels. And so, like, when I said, Sinaloa doesn't operate in St. Louis or Memphis,
Right.
their customers operate, but the customers
Mhm.
aren't part of the organization. They're the customers.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean other cartels aren't operating in St. Louis or Memphis, maybe the Gulf, maybe Juarez. So when people are saying, well, you're lying, there's cartel here. Well, not Sinaloa.
Right.
And so, one person like, my mom says you're lying because there's cartel all over Oklahoma. Well, Oklahoma is just north of Texas. Just south of Texas are 3 different cartels. Presumably,
Yeah.
they all have to cross Oklahoma to get to their markets. None of them are Sinaloa. And so, again, it's an, uh, there's, it's a little bit of fear mongering, and it's a little bit of painting with too broad of a brush.
Mhm.
And so when you say, well, we're going to target Sinaloa's operations, look, 75% of their activity in the United States happens in Los Angeles. Like in my era, they had about 7 or 8 distributors operating in LA that handled 90% of their activity in the US. During Jay Flores' era, he said they were up to about 15 guys. That's 80% of the trafficking activity in the US is 15 guys in LA.
15 guys in LA operating 80% of the drug trade for Sinaloa. That is an insane stat.
And because the guy, now remember, Jay sold $2 billion of their product. Like,
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you got guys that can do it at that level, you don't need many more.
interesting thing is, because look, after NAFTA took effect in 1994, Sinaloa adopted what was essentially a regional distribution hub model. So they maintained their base of operations in LA, and then they opened up distribution centers in Chicago, New York, and Atlanta. Then there's a logistical hub just outside of Fort Bragg in North Carolina that serves as the emergency for any one of the 3 East Coast hubs if they get taken down. One of the points that one of the other guys made is like, well, the DEA says there's 400 cells in the United States. Like, are you people insane? Do you understand? Sinaloa is a transportation network. They have to have at the receiving end shops that are big enough, mechanic shops that are big enough to handle tractor trailers. They're not just pulling over on the street unloading duffel bags. So that means they got to have
Right.
legitimate business. They'll have in Chicago, they had a mechanic shop for tractor trailers in Joliet and another one in Cicero. Then they'll have 2, maybe 3 of these type of business, 2 mechanic shops, and then they'll have a company that handles warehouses. So if the trucking company in LA is complicit, they have hidden compartments in the trucks. If the trucking company isn't complicit, they just hide it in the cargo. So then they drop off a cargo, a container full of lettuce. Well, hidden in the container will be the product. You have to have warehouses. Well, these are enormous businesses that they have to own. They don't have 400 mechanic shops all over the US. They send it from LA to Chicago, and everybody in the Midwest, if you're a Mexican national or a Mexican American with a pre-approved credit, you report to Chicago to get your product. And this is the point that I think Jay was making because his operation was out of Chicago. So he moved to Guadalajara. So you understand, when 20 tons arrives to Mexico, half of the shipment gets sold in Mexico. The Mexicans that are buying it in Mexico will take delivery at a regional distribution hub. So if you're from Cleveland, your product will get delivered to Chicago. They guarantee delivery to the regional distribution hub. Once
And then it's them to get it where they want to take.
you contract with local groups, maybe other Mexicans, maybe Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, whatever local, there's all kinds of the regional distribution hubs create clusters of other operations that are like little feeder fish.
Yeah, I got you.
So half of the 20 tons get sold in Mexico and designated to a regional distribution hub. The other half, the other 10, gets sold in Los Angeles. No, 75 to 80% of the other 10 gets sold in LA by the 15 guys. The rest, the other 15, are the ones that get sent to the distribution hubs for the local distributors in New York, Chicago, and Atlanta. So by the time the product gets to LA, 80% of it's already spoken for. And so basically, their operations consist of transportation. And so you'll have 2 distribution cells in LA and a transportation cell. So one distribution cell was controlled by Zambada. The second distribution cell was controlled by Obama. The transportation cell was controlled by Nacho Coronel. The cell smuggling the product across the American border was Chapo Guzman. So now Jay Flores moved to Guadalajara. He would talk to Zambada's right-hand man, Herman Olivares. He'd tell G, hey, this week we need 900 keys. So G calls the number one in LA, the distribution cell, say, hey, 900 to Chicago for Jay. The number one in LA for the distribution cell calls the number one for the transportation cell, hey, we need 900 to Chicago for Jay. The transportation cell guy says, we got 3 tractor trailers ready to go. So they load up the 900 in 3 trucks. They send one on Monday, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday. The number one in the transportation cell guy in LA calls the cell head in Chicago, says, hey, you got 3 trucks on the way. So the Monday truck arrives on Wednesday, they unload the 300. Tuesdays on Thursdays, Wednesdays on Saturday, on Fridays, and they're done. Once Jay Flores' representative in Chicago gets those 300 and 300 key deliveries, the Sinaloa cartel's operations are over.
Yep, they've got no more involved.
No more involvement. They're already counting their money in Mexico. So when you say you're targeting the cartels, you need to focus your attention on Los Angeles, or targeting Sinaloa, Los Angeles, and primarily the trucking. See, what people don't understand is Los Angeles is home to the 2 biggest ports on the West Coast. Los Angeles and Long Beach together form the largest port complex in the United States. Well, Los Angeles is also the largest trucking capital in the United States because we got the 2 ports. Well, you need trucks to be able to move the product across the country. And so they have the regional distribution hubs in Chicago, New York, and Atlanta, where they'll have truck shops there to receive the tractor trailers. They don't have mechanic shops in Dayton, Ohio, Des Moines, Iowa, Louisville, Kentucky. You don't send 400 teams. How are you going to keep that quiet? When you operate clandestinely, you send small units. When the United States sends covert forces to go undertake a mission, you don't send in the 82nd Airborne. There's nothing covert about the 82nd Airborne. You send in a special forces team, 10, 12 guys. Or the distribution cell in LA, you'll have 2 of them. They're 6 to 7 guys. You're going to have a supplemental team that handles the stash houses. So between the 2 distribution cells and the stash houses, you realistically got maybe 20 guys. You're going to have a transportation cell. They handle the trucking companies. Now, that's the LA operation. You got 15 distributors and maybe 15 support personnel. That's the largest cluster in the United States. So then when the product gets to Jay Flores' distributor, his operative in Chicago, the operative in Chicago now handles the business. This is all American trafficking from this point forward. The guys from Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Louisville, Indianapolis, St. Louis, Memphis. If you're a Mexican national or a Mexican American who's been approved to deal with the cartel distributor, you report to Chicago to get your load. Now, you don't have to physically go. You can contract with the local group to bring it to you in Louisville, but it's coming from Chicago. The cartel doesn't set up receiving cells in 400 cities. See, what they have in 400 cities are customers. But the customers report to the regional distribution cell. And that's the case because here in the United States, the FBI, and I'm no big fan of law enforcement, but understand, the FBI is the most professional law enforcement agency in the world. The FBI, the DEA, they're extraordinarily competent at what they do. Are you telling me there's 400 cells operating in the United States and not one of them got apprehended last year? Not one of them the year before? Not one the year before? The reason why they're not getting apprehended is the same reason why Bigfoot's never been apprehended. They don't exist. You've got 15 guys in LA that handle 80% of the trafficking activity. And those 15 guys in LA, they're gone after 3 or 4 years. They rotate. So by the time the feds get onto them, so when they got to me, I was the first of the guys up in West LA. Everybody in Orange County cooperated. The guys in San Francisco cooperated. Almost all the guys in Honolulu cooperated. Like everybody was falling. They're like, okay, well, we know you know Robles, and we know you know the Mexicans. They didn't even know who the Mexicans' names were, but they finally got to someone who they believed could identify who's the number one. Well, I knew who the number one was. And on the Coke side, and with respect to the Mets side, I actually knew his real name. Well, I'm not saying, hey, his nickname's El Paisa. His nickname is Paco. They're screaming at me. We know you know their names. And, I foolishly turned down the opportunity to help myself and following my arrest. And so that opportunity lapsed for them. Well, shortly
Right.
after I get knocked off, they were there from 92, 93 to 96. Then they rotate. So the FBI, after the guy does his 3 years in LA as the regional distribution head, he leaves. They got to find the new guy. They're back to square one.
And by the time they build a case, which could take 1 to 3 years, and even get somewhat of an identifier of the guy, then he leaves, and now they're back to square one. So it's a revolving door. Yeah.
The teams that come to the United States. So you're back to square one, and nobody knows their name. Like it was just a fluke that I heard one of the guys' names. Like it was just a fluke event. But
It's very smart.
yeah, no, that's why there's very few. Excuse me. That's why there's very few actual cartel cases. So when people say, well, they're operating in what was that place? Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Like, are you insane?
That dude, I don't know. I watched that and just was shaking my head because some of the places he was even saying didn't even make sense. They weren't even where he said he was at. He was saying Myrtle Beach was a meeting spot between Fayetteville and somewhere else. I mean, like that's fucking 2.5 hours away from each other. I don't know. I don't know what he was talking about.
When I first transferred to the prison in Florida, my cellmate was from South Carolina,
Right.
and he was a bartender at one of the upscale resorts, like a Four Seasons type, Ritz Carlton type hotel. And
Yeah.
so every 10 days to 2 weeks, he would drive from South Carolina either over to North Carolina, or he'd drive to Atlanta to pick up product.
Right.
He was a small time player, picking up 2 keys here, 3 keys there. But they're not bringing it to him.
Right.
You report
That's on him to go get.
you report to the local distribution hub. And since he was such a small operator, he wasn't talking to a cartel guy. He was talking to someone 3 or 4 degrees of separation from the nearest cartel guy. But so now the guy may be corrected. The Myrtle Beach guy may be going to Fayetteville, but he's not dealing with the cartel guy. He's just a small time operator.
What part of South Carolina was the guy from? You remember?
Do you guys have a Columbia, something?
Columbia.
Yeah, he's a real nice area, and
Yeah. I'm in Charleston, and Columbia's about an hour from Charleston.
Yeah. And so he'd make the commute over, and I was only a cellie for a few days. We only talked for a little bit, but I asked like, where do you report to? And he's like, well, I had to go to either Atlanta or Carolina, Fayetteville area. I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like that's how I knew he wasn't full of shit.
Fayetteville, I would be a lot closer to here. Fayetteville from Columbia is probably three-ish hours. Atlanta, you're looking at 5+, depending on where at.
Yeah. And so but the regional distribution hub model explains how the operations are structured. And, I made that point. Jay Flores makes the point. And yet we got literally bombarded with thousands of people. You don't know what you're talking about. Like, are you insane?
I get tired of, I respond to some of them when I have some time, if I'm just chilling or I'm somewhere waiting or getting my oil changed, but it just gets tiresome responding to the same damn comments. I had the same thing with our, Meech episodes. People's like, oh, he read it because of this reason. He got a time cut. And I'm just like, I copied and pasted I broke down basically the time that he got. I'm like, all right, he got this. He was going to get this anyway because it was Fed time. This law changed. He got this much off. And I just would literally copy and paste that every single time. Just go, I mean, it's like, it's a head scratcher, but I mean, that's what turns the wheels on YouTube, unfortunately.
What I'm surprised about is just how emotionally invested people are with respect to the issue. I mean, look, there's a difference between the cartel's activity and the higher level trafficking. Like if you're targeting high level traffickers, then put your agents in Minneapolis and Indianapolis and St. Louis and Memphis. But if you're targeting the cartel guys, put them in Chicago, put them in Los Angeles. Sinaloa guys, I mean, specifically. I got to qualify it now, otherwise I get bombarded.
Right.
And
You got to
so if
qualify.
you're targeting Sinaloa guys, you got to be in their specific hubs. And
Well, Pete, what's happened is everybody's watched Narcos, so now everyone's an expert. That's what's happened. That's why everybody's such an expert on the subject matter.
another interesting point is, like they use in the United States, they use citizenship as a filter. And so a Mexican, we in the United States tend to view Mexicans as Mexicans. Well, they don't see themselves that way. If you're a Mexican in Cincinnati, but you're from one of the states that was operating under Sinaloa's auspices, you're not dealing with the guy from Tamaulipas. That's a Gulf cartel guy.
Right.
You're not dealing with the guy from Chihuahua. That's a Juarez cartel guy. So depending on where you are, like if you're the Mexican nationals from one of the states that are controlled by Sinaloa are in a privileged position. That means they can deal directly with the regional distributor in Chicago, or they can go to Los Angeles. See, what the point people don't understand is the market in the United States is dynamic. So the price may be 23,000 a key in Chicago. Well, the price is 18,000 a key in Los Angeles. So now if you're picking up 200 units, you can save yourself $1 million.
And that's why when we covered Meech, he was going to LA. A lot of his product was coming out of LA, funneling to Detroit, Atlanta, and those other areas.
Because he could have bought it from a distributor in Atlanta, but now he's paying the Atlanta price.
Right.
So he said, no, I'll buy it in LA. And then they were shipping it in like modified limos or whatever the hell they were using.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the large traffickers within the higher trafficking community, the game is to develop a contact in Los Angeles. If you're a Mexican or Mexican American with ties to Sinaloa territory in Mexico. And if you have an even better connection, like the Flores twins did, they moved to Guadalajara. So they're getting the Mexico price.
Right.
The price of the kilos in Tijuana are much cheaper than the price in LA, and they're much cheaper than the price in Chicago. Now, guys in Chicago that are paying for the product at the Chicago price, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, black guys, non-cartel level Mexicans, white guys. That's just.
And this concept doesn't just like stop with drugs. I mean, obviously, it's everybody that it deals. If you own your own business and you're buying a specific product, your goal should be to get to the source so you get the best price to maximize your profitability, whatever it is, even if it's legal. That is the goal that everybody tries to do is cut out the middleman, get as close to the source as you can get. That way you get the best price, you get the best return on investment. It's just obviously profits are highly, multiplied when you're talking, illegal narcotics. But it's the same principle. And you and I think, was text messaging this week about the same principle. I applied a lot of it, in other things. I mean, I apply the drug trade logic to about anything because on the basis of how they say, okay, you do here, we're going to get the cheapest price. That motto will work in a legitimate business.
Look, that's how it's always been for those individuals operating in the United States. In my case, there was literally the people that were ultimately charged. You had Robles, you had me. We were the two Latinos. Everybody else were white guys and a couple of Samoans. And so none of those, all of them are trying to get next to somebody who can get the product at a good price. And so you had white guys coming in from Chicago, white guys coming in from New York, because their price in New York, by the time the guy gets it in New York, he's paying 24.5, 25,000 a key. Whereas coming to LA, he may end up getting it for 17.5, 18, depending on how good the relationship is.
Mhm.
So if I'm getting them for 14.5, I can flip them for 17.5, but I'm not taking no risk.
Right. You're just the getting it from that person to that person. Yeah, you're flipping it.
Now, the guys that are at the cartel level customers, they're dealing with the distributors in Los Angeles because, like I said, in 94, 5 years into Sinaloa's existence, they adopted the regional distribution hub model, which also included insurance. Because for the first 5 years, all of their trafficking activity happened in Los Angeles.
Mhm.
You had to come to LA to get product. Well, Sinaloa was the smallest of the cartels. So, in order to gain market share in the United States, they adopted the regional distribution hub model. Now, today it's nothing special, but in 94, it was revolutionary. Once they started insuring the loads, well, people started coming to LA. You can come from Cleveland or come from Cincinnati or come from New York or Boston because you're going to get, they handle all the transportation. So that's one less headache you got to deal with. And they guarantee the load up into the distribution hub. Well, who's going to turn down insurance? So it revolutionized the higher level trafficking operations. Because they
Mhm.
were the smallest, they had to innovate. Whereas the other cartels were just situated along the border. Well, hey, it's not very sophisticated to go 10 miles into San Diego.
Yeah.
So whether the guys, so the one of the reasons for Sinaloa's ultimate success is they had to come up with innovative solutions to these challenges that caused them to essentially revolutionize how higher level trafficking operations conducted here in the United States. But what most people here are doing, they're conflating the customers, the first tier wholesale level customers, with the actual distributors.
Mhm.
Now, you understand why law enforcement would do that, because I can assure you the special agent in charge of Minneapolis, he doesn't want to have to say, well, we got no Sinaloa presence in Minneapolis. Because if you don't have a presence, they're going to cut your funding.
Yeah, they're gonna cut the budget.
So all of a sudden now they're in Des Moines, they're in Louisville, they're in Minneapolis, they're in Helena, Montana. Like, are you people insane? The first tier wholesale level customers deal directly either with the guy in LA or with the guy in Chicago. Now, who those customers deal with? Second order, third order, fourth order customers.
Right.
None of those people are cartel guys. Like I made the point on Borderland where east of the Mississippi, you don't got 25 guys. And west of the Mississippi, maybe 40. Like the entire operation for Coke is maybe 65
Mhm.
guys nationwide. And then you replicate it for, meth is a totally different compound, the same
Right.
infrastructure, but it's the same level of operation.
Right.
And so,
Interesting stuff, man. Always good to have you on, my friend. I love it to get these facts, and I even like it more when you can have these things substantiated by, like, the gentleman whose podcast you went on. They reached out to their contacts because I think out of everybody that I've ever interviewed, and I think I looked today, and I'm not sure if it counts shorts with videos, but it's like 500 uploads, so maybe it's not quite 500 standalone interviews, but without a doubt, you're like the most in-depth, detail-oriented guy that I've ever had on. And it's a privilege to have you on and hold these conversations. But you know, you bring a lot of facts to the situation, which a lot of people can't bring. And even with those facts, like you said, sometimes you're going to get questioned by people that have no idea what they're talking about. They watch 2 seasons of Narcos and they know how everything works, and they think you have no clue and you didn't do anything, and you don't even know what you're talking about, and they don't even know who you are. And it's just that's the uninformative society that has the right to speak their mind, but often when they do, they erase all doubt that they have no fucking clue what they're talking about.
well, like I said, too many people watch The Wire
Yeah,
or, what was it, the mess show Breaking Bad or whatever the hell it is. Like, I've never seen any of
yeah,
those programs.
yeah,
And so, and I hear people commenting, and I'm like, what do you look, man? That's Hollywood. That's
Yeah.
not how things work. We were having a conversation the other day, and like in movies, you see like these transactions are depicted, and you've got men standing around with AKs. Like, I've never seen that. I never once
Yeah.
saw a firearm at any transaction ever.
Because at those you don't need them. That's not what this is. This is not street deals.
There's almost no theft at that level. First of all, if you're only dealing primarily, if the main distributors are Mexican nationals, well, their families back in Mexico are the collateral.
Mhm.
You're
Yeah, and they're not.
not going to rip off the cartel distributor because mom and dad back in Cuernavaca or in Guadalajara are the security.
Yeah. I'll tell the story and we can close out with this. So Matt and I interviewed a guy that was on the team that was taking down BMF. He set up all the wiretaps. And at the time, the show that you referenced earlier, The Wire, was on TV. And these guys are doing very similar stuff. And so they have a wire set up on these guys. They're talking about the wire, where in the show, the police finally get wiretaps on their phones. And in the shows, they're dumping phones every couple of days and then buying new burners. That's how they stayed a step ahead. And so every time they would get the wiretap up, boom, it would go down. They would have to figure out a way to kind of keep it going. These guys, the BMF guys, were talking about, hey, did you see the wire? You see what they're doing? They're dumping the phones every couple of days. I'm glad we ain't got to do that. And Rand, the guy's name was Rand. He said they're sitting there going, holy shit, I hope they don't take notes from this because then we got to start this process all over again. And he's like, luckily they were like, yeah, but they don't know what the hell we doing. I mean, they thought they were so invincible that it was like, good thing we ain't got to do that. And he's like, yeah, because I mean, they're sitting, they have the answer to what they're literally getting listened to, talking about it. And Ray's like, oh shit, they're gonna dump their phones. We're gonna be everything's gonna be shot to hell. And he's like, yeah, but we ain't got to do all that.
It's funny because when I speak with the kids, they're all just talking about burner phones. Well, when I was operating, literally, I was reprogramming cell phones. So I was changing the
Right,
numbers faster than the FBI could either get their wiretaps or utilize roving wiretaps because I would secure the information. I would pirate the data by taking the information off every cell phone operating on Sunset Boulevard. So it was perfectly random. And so I was, like, that would be so much easier the way they got it now.
right. Oh
Whereas,
yeah,
but I mean, it's the the principles are the same.
yeah,
And that's why, like, when I get invited to speak for law enforcement groups, it's like you can't understand how things operate today without understanding the history. Because if you
mhm,
didn't understand the significance of the NAFTA regional distribution hub model, because once I explained that, like I remember one of the special forces guys, he's like, "That's why their footprint is so small." Like, yeah, you get it.
yeah.
They're
Well, thank you for coming on, my friend. This is why I love having you on, man. You always come with great information, and I definitely appreciate it.
and if you like I said, if you do want, we can do an episode on writing stories in prison if you'd like next time.
I do I do wanna do that because you've actually got some good news. I'll save it till that episode, but some possible good news that we can work with. I don't wanna let the cat out the bag, so to speak. But yeah, definitely wanna cover that and the writing in prison because that's another thing, like, you were in prison for quite a while, and we know a mutual friend of ours that was in prison for quite a while, and they've done a lot of writing, and that's like a whole story in and of itself of just the stories that you come across in prison because you're getting at that point, you're podcasting without the recording equipment. You're getting these guys telling you these great stories, but you're just having to memorize it unless you choose to write it down and
No,
document it.
no, like, yeah, I would document. The, they had no problem sharing the stories. It was just like, keep
Right.
don't use their real names.
Yeah, yeah. Which that's understandable.
I mean, yeah. So look, the last 3 years of my bid, I was, two and a half of them were dealing with COVID pandemic lockdowns.
Mhm.
And my friend was already on the street and he had his podcast going. So I was doing all the stuff, I was, pulling up content for him, like, oh, this guy's story and this guy's story. And so yeah, it worked real interesting. We'll talk about that next time if you'd like.
All right. Well, that sounds good, man. I appreciate you stopping by this time, buddy.
Okay. Have a good night.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Hollywood Wade. That was Pete Rausini, and unfortunately, we were out of time. We'll see you next week on Crime and Entertainment.